Alright, so yeah, I'm going back to a series that we were doing recently, and we're coming back much sooner than I thought we would, because I remember If It Bleeds feels like it just came out, and I remember reading it like right around the time it came out. And then I remember right after that reading that like all four stories already had like their rights sold for movies, and it was like it was all moving so quickly, and then sure enough, here's the first one already, and it just happens to be the first one in the book. And I actually really loved every story that's in this one, but I wasn't quite sure how some of them would and will come to screen and how they'll adapt. And this one was especially interesting because it comes from John Lee Hancock, who isn't exactly the most inspired choice, and he not only directed it but also adapted it into a screenplay, and with help bringing it to life from Ryan Murphy and Jason Blum. So a lot of names were kind of all over this. And it's kind of interesting that this was the story that attracted all these names and was the first one to get out, because it does feel very downplayed compared to, like, you know, the If It Bleeds story itself, or Rat even. But I'm really curious how The Life of Chuck's going to adapt to screen. But I have an idea in my head, but I'm wondering how close that idea will actually be to what it actually ends up being. But yeah, so for now, we're going to talk about Mr. Harrigan's phone. And right away, I will just say that I was a little worried at first because they do something here that kind of goes against what I thought was so great about reading Mr. Harrigan's phone, and that was when you go into like a Stephen King collection, what I really love about it and him in general is that you're never quite sure if you're getting horror or not. You could get horror, or you could get something like really deep and profound and existential, or both. And this one is one of those ones that does kind of hit both, but it's definitely one before it's the other. And so there was kind of this, you know, joy and anticipation about reading it, that I really wasn't sure where it was going and whether or not it was going to be horror. So the fact that the opening narration just straight up says like everything that happens, where it's the shot of Craig running to the cliff, which will ultimately be the last scene, where he just kind of says everything. He mentions the ticket, he mentions Kenny, and he mentions that people are going to die. And it's like that kind of, I feel like that kind of shows its hand a little quick, because one of the great things about reading it was kind of watching it unravel. But then again, I guess that's part of the adaptation process, where a book's audience is going to be much more patient than a movie's audience, especially when your movie's on Netflix and is, you know, being advertised as like a Stephen King horror movie or something. But I will say, I don't know how people really reacted to the story itself, because I was surprised when I finished the movie and I had the feelings that I did, that when I looked it up, I didn't really read any like specific reviews or anything, but I saw that it's apparently not very well liked, certainly not by critics, and it didn't seem like people didn't seem to really take to it either, but that could be the target audience not really getting what they expected. But then again, if the target audience is a Stephen King audience, then they would know, because surely any Stephen King fan that's watching this movie would have read the story by now. And the thing about it is that the movie in its script is a almost shockingly right down to it adaptation, like practically word for word and scene by scene, with just a few added touches here and there, to make it probably just a tiny bit longer than it needs to be. But yeah, so we talked before, when we talked about Where the Crawdads Sing, about the perils of doing like an actual direct adaptation. But you can also do it, you know, perfectly well, like the Coen brothers do with like No Country for Old Men and True Grit and stuff like that. And this is another one of those cases where it feels like pretty much directly lifted from the page, just with some minor changes. And honestly, I more or less felt about the movie the way I felt about the story. So I'm not quite sure what fell short for people. I'll look into that eventually, but I just find myself caring less and less about I guess the opinions of others when it comes to movies, especially after I've felt what I'm gonna feel. But yeah, so it's a pretty direct, if the story's here and the movie's there, and it's pretty much the same feelings came out. So I didn't really see any of those times that I saw, like in Where the Crawdads Sing, where it was like there was a like the issue was that it was too direct of an adaptation, despite the fact that it's pretty much the exact same thing. One thing that definitely is going to help for sure is the perfect casting of Donald Sutherland. Like, it's one of those cases where I can't remember how I pictured Mr. Harrigan when I read it the first time. I did read it a second time before I saw the movie, which it probably helps this story a lot, but we'll get into that. But, yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how I saw anybody but Donald Sutherland at this point, because there's really no other possible way you can take that without getting the exact desired effect. Like, I can imagine multiple, Mr. Harrigan casting choices, but I just feel like Sutherland is basically the ideal one. Like if they made a list, I'm sure Donald Sutherland was at the very top, and it's like, here's some other possibilities. So that's gonna work a lot, especially with how intimidating Harrigan is supposed to be. Like when he first walks into the church, and like it's like time stands still. And then the moment when Craig first comes into the house, and there's that great shot where he's just like sitting in the middle of the room. And like he's just there in the background until Craig finds him, just looking around. And I feel like all of that really set up not just the intimidating nature of Harrigan himself, but the house itself and just everything about how everything feels big but also empty is something that I feel like they really established well. And the way that Craig eventually describes him as terrifying and exciting is pretty exact to what it should be and how it actually feels. Seeing Donald Sutherland play this character, because there's also going to be the warmth that's in there, which is really important, especially with how that's going to contrast with how we feel about Mr. Harrigan as the story goes on, and he becomes a bit of a kind of a scary horror figure while being totally off-screen, being totally out of sight, which is really well done, and that's something that I felt like probably could have been really hard to execute and take from the page to the screen. But like I said, doing the direct adaptation exactly the way it is on the page pretty much, I feel like did a lot of favors for being able to pull this off and not trying to change too much about it. Because on top, before we even get to this moment, we do have like the touching moments, like when he asks Craig like why he still comes after all these years, because we do get a pretty fast time jump, much faster than we get in the story itself. Where most of the movie takes place while Craig is in high school. But this moment is really, like, it really establishes Harrigan as, like, this really human sort of character. Then it's, and like I was talking about, the way it's going to contrast with how we feel about him later, but also not just what's going to happen later, but what has happened in the past also, where he has this reputation of being this person that essentially ruins lives. For another King comparison, he was sort of an Ups and Pratt kind of character, the E.G. Marshall character from Creepshow, before he ended up here in this town, in this house, with Craig reading to him. And so he's still kind of seeing the after effects of that, with that being why he's so isolated and alone, and why people still hate him and all that. But how we know vague details about it, but we don't know exact details to where he still just seems like, a lonely old guy to us without that sort of nature to him. But once again, because of the casting of Donald Sutherland, just that by itself, I feel like, and I don't know if I'm just thinking about, like, his most recent part in The Undoing, but it's like there's something about him where he doesn't really need to do much for you to get the idea that he might have, like, if he's kind of got this intimidating presence now, and how amplified that must have been throughout his life when he was, like, the ultimate businessman that everybody sort of feared and hated. And it's like, just, seeing Donald Sutherland kind of gives you that idea of what that probably was like, and how he's gotten to this point, and eventually how he's going to be viewed in death. So, going into that also, and now that he's established that, there's the Mr. Harrigan that has to get addicted to the phone, and addicted to technology after pushing it away so much. And there's this really great moment when he first gives him the phone, and then when he's looking through it, and when Craig goes to take it to tell him something, or show him something else about it, after he's shown him the stock and stuff like that. There's like a really subtle moment where he kind of pulls away when Craig tries to take it the first time. And there are moments where, like, the whole idea of Harrigan essentially predicting the future with this is a great moment in the book. I do think the narration in the movie does add a bit of a redundancy to it, where it's like when Harrigan's just sort of saying that, it's like we get, in our minds and think like, oh yeah, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly the way it went down, and he knows everything that's going to happen. And it's like, and that's a great moment when Sutherland is saying these lines, but then we have the narration come on and say exactly what we were already thinking, which was, yeah, that stuff did come true. And it's like, yeah, thanks narration, we know. So that's probably something that we could have done without. I was trying to think if we could have done without the narration entirely, because there are some great moments where the book's being told from the perspective of present day Craig, and some of his outlooks, like when he's describing, the idea of Mr. Harrigan being underground and the phone being there, and stuff like that, adds like this eerie note to it where we really get inside of how, Craig's imagination is running wild. But I don't really think that's captured too much in the movie's narration, so we probably mostly could have done without it. That's probably the biggest change I would make. But apart from that, it's pretty much smooth sailing to me. I especially love one of the things I was really afraid they were going to change, because with rights you're never quite sure where anything's going to land. The fact that they were able to use "Stand By Your Man" for the movie. That's another one of those cases where once you read the book, I can't really imagine another song in its place. And there is that moment where it's like the first time he mentions "Stand By Your Man" in the book, and he says that song just gives me chills now in a really bad way. And yeah, you get that sense where they do, because it is kind of an old technique to take a song that's otherwise unthreatening and then have a horror story make it, threatening or creepy or whatever. And sometimes it's kind of played out, but here I feel like it really works. Especially the way they utilize it in the movie itself, like sort of like how 1408 utilized "We've Only Just Begun." And I don't even think that was part of the King's story, was it? I think the movie itself just did that, because 1408 is amazing. But yeah, here the way they use it, there's the moment when Craig first discovers Mr. Harrigan dead, and there's the moment in the book when he has this, like I said, his imagination's running wild. And he's like, even though he's dead, I had this, thought. And I feel like we can all sort of relate to this, because that's one of the things that King does so well, is like, finds these really ridiculous fears. But then when he displays them, it's like, yeah, I've had that ridiculous fear before. This idea that Harrigan was going to, like, come to life and grab him. And I'm really glad that movie Craig didn't have a vision of that. But they still put a jump scare in here. This very perfectly timed one, where he had his finger right over the phone getting ready to call Craig, and so when his thumb just kind of accidentally gets bumped into it slightly, it makes Craig's phone go off, and it's the song. That was really well done, and that was a really good way to kind of include sort of a jump moment in that scene without it being too, monster movie-like or too out of left field. Where it established Craig's fear there of something happening when he touched him, and that was really well done. And then there is the idea of whether or not he can hear it underground. I guess the movie didn't really have to go into it, but I do like the debate in the book about Craig not being sure if he's actually hearing it or not, or if it's just his mind kind of taking him there. There is one thing that the movie took out that I kind of felt like would have worked if they had kept it in, which was, and it's especially weird because we actually see the start of this. It's the moment where anytime he calls in the story, the recorded message comes on that says, I'll call you back if it seems appropriate, so he can actually hear his voice. And that's like one of the eerie things about it, is still hearing his voice from beyond the grave on this recording. And we see them record that voice message in the movie, but then they don't use it, I don't think, whenever he calls throughout the movie. And I felt like that was kind of missing, because I felt like that definitely added to the eerie factor of him kind of seeming like he was coming from beyond the grave. I guess I can also see where Hancock might have thought it was unnecessary, but I don't know, I think it would have worked if it was kept in. But that was, I think the reason it just really sticks out to me, like, I don't know how much I actually care, I just think it's weird that he records the voice message in the movie and they didn't use it. That was, I didn't know where that was coming from, but, Yeah, so going forward, like I said, every now and then there'll be some random changes, like the teacher that Craig falls in love with. I did find it interesting that I think her name is Mrs. Hargensen in the book, and it's like maybe they thought people would put together how kind of ironic that is. That I'm almost positive Hargensen wasn't that Chris's name in Carrie, the bully in Carrie. And so now Hargensen is like the sort of school savior for this person. And they've changed it to Hart at this point, which might be a little on the nose, but yeah, it's fine. The way they establish how Craig sort of falls in love with her, but they don't really put that into words or anything. It's really just sort of the looks that he gives, but then and the way we can see that sort of transition from it being a crush to him being like friends with her. That's something that they don't that they do that without dialogue in the movie. I feel like as well, and that's something that they could have really sort of messed up with exposition and narration and stuff like that. But for the most part, I feel like they handled it well. And then the way we establish this in when we're not quite sure when the horror is going to creep back in. We know if we've read the story, but trying to look at it from the perspective of somebody that's just seeing the movie. And it's like, so I can see these moments being kind of dull for somebody that doesn't know the story, because we know, who have read the story, to anticipate that the horror is coming back around and Mr. Harrigan's phone is coming back around. So we get these moments like him waiting for Harrigan to knock on the wall. And there's this. What's really great about this, and the reason I think this scene is especially well done, is not only do they use Stand By Your Man as a jump scare again, which I feel like in another movie I would criticize for saying like, oh, you use that again. But I felt like it worked every time, honestly. Interestingly enough. But what I really loved about this scene was that even having read the story and knowing that Harrigan does not knock on the wall, I love that there was enough of a silence between Craig asking for that and something happening that even though I know it's coming or not coming, there's still an anticipation there. There's still suspense in there that's just kind of holding on. And I felt like that scene was really, really well done as well, and really well adapted. They do add a scene here and there, but really just one particular scene stands out. The moment where he actually goes to Bilodeau's house, the guy that Harrigan ultimately made, essentially drove to suicide. And at first I was like, is this really necessary? And I was like, why are you trying to get to a specific runtime when we don't really need this scene? But I do think there was something here by the end of it where he goes and he investigates the truck and he finds, the scratch-off ticket and the spray paint that that essentially symbolizes "fuck you, Harrigan." And I did feel like at first that was pointless, but then at the same time I like how it did kind of show more vividly about that bad side of Harrigan that we don't get to see, we've only heard about. But also just this idea that there's an eerie enough nature around the scene that you do get that sense that Harrigan's like a bringer of death, and how that's sort of carried over into his apparent afterlife as this story goes on. So I do feel like it serves that purpose enough, and I'm not mad for it being here, even though it's, probably a scene we could take or leave, but I do like how it just kind of pushes us a little more in that direction of bringing Harrigan out a little more, but also it feels like the more we learn about him, the more mysterious he still is, which is really interesting. And I think that just the way this whole concept is, and how there's not really much explanation that goes into it, which is probably the best way to do a concept like this. To just not have any sort of supernatural explanation or anything like that. You just kind of have to take it as it is, and if you're on board, then that's great, and if not, then you're probably not going to be into it. Because for the people that can hold on and go with it, it is very, very rewarding for in situations like this. And yeah, in between these sort of, suspenseful scenes and these eerie scenes, we do still have the more touching scenes, like when he's moving out and he has that moment with his dad. And when we know that the story is starting to go back into this dark direction when Miss Hart dies in the car accident with her fiance, but I like the way they played that up with the the flashing of his memories as we see her car accident. That's another thing that might seem a little on the nose. But once again, for some reason, on the nose just doesn't seem to be bothering me for this movie. When it typically does. So it was doing something right, at least to me. But, yeah, and then we go in that direction. Like I said, I can understand where people might be underwhelmed by it. Because I remember the first time I read the story and it got to the ending, I did kind of have this feeling of, is that really it? But then reading, like I said, reading it a second time helped a lot when it really establishes that there's nothing more to the concept, where it's like you're probably waiting for some other big payoff, when it's like the payoff that we're waiting for is that he needs to let this go and he needs to let Mr. Harrigan go. And there's, obviously you can throw in a whole allegory about, you know, the attachment to technology and stuff like that. That's all very apparent, so much so that it doesn't really need much explaining. But it's really like this human element that I really take to. And like I said, the human element is something that can really go overlooked when people talk about King in general, because he's so well known for his horror and his monster stuff. And it's like his really human stuff and his existential stuff, and even like the human stories that are going on in his monster stories and how they sort of run parallel to each other and kind of have the same sort of things going on. There's always so much more to King, I feel like, than lets on, that a lot of people would. I feel like the fans of King have known this for decades, but I still also feel like there's almost stigmatism to it, where he's not as like highbrow as other authors or anything like that, or just other fiction in general. But the really deep places he can go, and these really human places he can take you that you recognize instantly, that you could never quite articulate yourself, is something that he always does so beautifully. And I really love in these stories where you can really tell that he's not losing his touch at all, and I really love that. See, I can see where this story would be underwhelming if you don't quite know what you're in for, but I feel like if you do, and if you're a fan of the story, then it's, like I said, it's pretty much a direct adaptation, so that's pretty much what it is. The one thing I didn't mention was Jade Martell's performance, which is also obviously really carrying this, especially when we lose Sutherland after the first half and he has nobody else to play off of, pretty much, at least for his big scenes. And he's already got King experience with the It movies. But here he really does bring something and really carries those scenes that he has to do alone, especially the emotion. Like, the very last scene where he's at Harrigan's grave, I feel like is just as satisfying of a climax as anything you could have given this story or this movie, and his performance is what brings us to that satisfying conclusion. And the scene also, like, he kind of has somebody to play off there, where he's getting the information about Dean Whitmore. But that scene also, like, in the car, where it still feels like he's really carrying the emotion, and we can really see, you know, the drive for revenge, but also the tragic nature of everything, and the balance of that, where it doesn't feel like there's too much of one and not enough of the other, and ultimately getting to our point where we reach an essential breaking point, where we have to let all of this go. And yeah, like I said, if that's the kind of story you're prepared for, then I find it very satisfying. But like I said, I also can see, especially on a first go-around, people being very underwhelmed. But I feel like it's the kind of story where the more you come back to it, the more satisfying it is. So hopefully other people discover that also, or they just loved it right away, which is also great. So, so I think I can go ahead and leave this at this. So, the next thing is going to be another Versus, I think, and then we're going to go into new releases, I think. All the horror new releases that I've missed, or at least the major ones, and Amsterdam and the Woman King and stuff like that, and then we'll go from there. I can't quite remember what's after that, but I think it'll be Versus for a bit there, like a few in a row or something, and then we'll go on to the next thing. And there's definitely more King coming as well. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.